May of 1565, the Ottoman Empire, then the strongest power in the Mediterranean, sent about 40,000 elite soldiers to besiege a small rocky island. On that island, there were only around 500 knights and roughly 6,000 Maltese who could take up arms to defend their homes. The Ottomans brought more than 80 siege guns. Among them were massive cannons that fired stone balls weighing over 70 kilograms. In their original plan, they believed 2 weeks would be enough to crush Malta. In reality, the siege lasted 4 months. During those 4 months, dead bodies were used instead of sandbags. Human heads were shoved into cannon barrels. The moats turned into a thick mixture of blood, boiling oil, foul water, and even human fat. In today's story, we will move slowly through why such a small force could resist such a powerful empire, why both sides gradually abandoned all rules of war, turning to corpses, disease, and fear as weapons, and why, after they survived and returned home, many of the men who fought there almost never wanted to speak of what they had seen. This is the Siege of Malta in 1565, one of those rare moments when war did not only take lives, but also dragged human beings below the moral limits they thought they had. If you feel that slowly told, clear, and respectful history stories are something you'd like to hear more of, I would be very grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support is what gives me the motivation to keep making deeper, more carefully crafted history videos, especially as a small tribute to the generation that has lived through so many changes in this century. Now, I invite you to join me in part 2, where we look at the background and the people who stood in the middle of the storm called Malta. By the middle of the 16th century, under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans had taken most of Hungary, besieged Vienna, controlled large parts of North Africa, and commanded the strongest navy in the Mediterranean. On that map of power, there was a tiny dot, the island of Malta. Malta lies between Sicily and the North African coast. It is a dry, rocky island with few natural resources, no rivers, and people surviving on rainwater stored in cisterns. The island was held by the Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Knights of St. John. They were the remnants of the Crusader orders that had been driven out of the Holy Land a few centuries earlier, then forced from Rhodes, and finally settled on Malta. On Malta, they were both a religious military order and a naval fighting force. They attacked Muslim merchant ships, took prisoners, freed Christian slaves, and severely damaged Ottoman trade. In the eyes of the Ottoman court, they were a thorn that could not be left in place for long. The leader of the knights at this time was Jean de Valette, a French nobleman in his 70s. His whole life was tied to the sea and to war. For a time, he had been captured and forced to sit on the rowing bench of a Muslim galley as a slave. He spoke Arabic and Turkish, understood his enemies, and in naval battles had killed enough Muslim fighters that the name Valette became something of a folk fear on the other side of the sea. When scouts reported that a great Ottoman fleet was heading toward Malta, Valette had about 500 knights, around 6,000 Maltese militiamen and some mercenaries, and 3 main defensive positions that many European engineers believed could not hold out long under a proper siege. On the Ottoman side, the land forces besieging the island were commanded by Mustafa Pasha. The fleet, about 200 warships, sailed under the command of Admiral Piali Pasha. Among the 40,000 soldiers, roughly 6,000 were janissaries, elite infantry taken as Christian children, converted, raised, and trained to be absolutely loyal warriors of the Sultan. They also had with them a veteran of the sea, Dragut, one of the most feared corsairs of the Mediterranean, a man who had raided Malta many times and knew its weaknesses well. On May 18, 1565, the Ottomans landed. They believed this would be a quick, decisive campaign. Malta, by comparison, was weak in every practical sense. No rich resources, no natural fresh water, only rainwater, very little arable land. The main defensive works were Fort St. Elmo, guarding the entrance to the harbour, and the fortified towns of Birgu and Sanglea, where the population and knights concentrated. At first, most believed St. Elmo might last 3 days at best. Instead, that small fort held out for more than a month, and it became the opening stage of a kind of warfare that many witnesses later struggled to describe in full. From the very first days, the Ottomans dragged their largest guns into place opposite Fort St. Elmo. Among them were 2 famous cannons, one known as the Basilisk, another bearing a name that openly mocked its enemies, the Destroyer of Christians. These guns fired stone balls weighing about 160 pounds, and every day they rained thousands of shots onto St. Elmo. The stone walls began to crack, then collapse. At night, many assumed the defenders inside the fort would be too exhausted to do anything. But the knights and the Maltese did something few expected. They crept out under cover of darkness, collected the stone cannonballs that the Ottomans had fired, brought them back inside, heated them until they were glowing red, and then fired them back, letting fire spread among the tents and powder stores of the besiegers. When sections of the wall collapsed, the defenders did not abandon the fort. Instead, they thought up ways to keep resisting that were even more disturbing. While they still had Ottoman prisoners, they killed those captives and mixed their blood with clay and lime to create a thick mortar, which they used to plug the cracks. When there were no prisoners left, they turned to the bodies of their own dead. Corpses were laid in the breaches, piled with earth and stone, and became part of the walls themselves. From that point on, the attackers were facing defences literally made with human flesh and bone, a sight that stayed with those who survived. The knights also had access to an ancient weapon, a variant of Greek fire. The original formula had been lost, but on Malta they created a mixture that burned hot and clung to whatever it touched. According to later accounts, they even mixed in rendered fat from Ottoman corpses to help it stick to skin, making it impossible to extinguish with water. When the first major Janissary assaults came in early June, they ran into a defensive system that was both brutal and carefully planned. Wooden hoops soaked in oil were set on fire and rolled down from the walls into packed infantry below. Crude flame-throwing devices sprayed burning oil at close range. Clay jars filled with quicklime were thrown down. When they shattered, clouds of lime burned eyes and skin, leaving climbers blinded and panicked. But the most frightening part was the defenders themselves. Many of the knights believed that if they died fighting Muslim enemies, they would go straight to heaven. When Ottoman soldiers managed to climb onto the walls, some knights would grab them in a tight embrace and leap off together, dragging both attackers and defenders down to the bottom of the ditch. As the battle dragged on, the methods of defense became even stranger. In some hollow cannonballs, the defenders stuffed wildcats and fired them into the enemy trenches. When the shells burst, the terrified animals exploded out into crowded lines of soldiers, adding chaos to an already packed battlefield. When normal cannon shot began to run low, the defenders loaded chains, nails, and broken glass into their guns, turning each blast into a storm of shrapnel. And at a certain point, human heads were loaded into the barrels as well. An Ottoman soldier who fell would have his head cut off, shoved into a cannon, and fired back toward his own lines. It was not only physically deadly, it was a psychological blow. The men on the receiving end did not just see an object flying toward them. They recognized the face of someone who had shared breakfast with them that very morning. Some of these heads were packed with gunpowder and fitted with crude fuses, so they would explode when they landed, showering nearby soldiers with bone fragments and flesh from their friends. During this time, Dragut, the seasoned corsair, arrived to help direct the siege. While he was inspecting the fortifications, a cannonball struck a wall, and flying stone fragments hit him in the head. He did not die immediately. He suffered for several days with severe brain injuries before finally succumbing. The Ottoman command tried to hide his death to prevent a collapse in morale. But the knights understood exactly what had happened, and they could see the uncertainty in the way the besiegers moved. On June 23rd, St. Elmo finally fell. In return, the Ottomans lost about 8,000 men, including roughly half of their janissaries. Inside the fort, they found around 1,500 Christian bodies, but only 9 knights still alive, and those few died shortly afterward from their wounds. For the Ottoman commanders, this was a clear warning. If such a small fort had cost so many lives, how high would the price be at Birgu and Senglea? After taking St. Elmo, Mustafa Pasha wanted to use its horror as a message to the remaining defenders. He ordered the bodies of the dead Christian defenders at St. Elmo to be beheaded, their hearts removed, their corpses hung on wooden frames and set adrift on the water so they would float slowly toward the main fortifications. Valette saw this and understood the message clearly. But he chose to answer in a way that shocked the Ottomans even more. All the Ottoman prisoners held at Birgu, hundreds of them, were executed. Their heads were loaded into cannons and mortars and fired back into the besieging camps. The head of one high-ranking officer was kept for a special delivery. It was loaded into the largest cannon and fired straight into the Ottoman command tent during a meeting. The head landed on the table in front of men who had been speaking with him not long before. From that point, the siege of Birgu and Senglea became a quiet competition. Which side could think of a way to hurt and terrify the other more? The Ottomans built a huge siege tower on floating platforms, planning to use it to attack the walls from the sea. They waited until it was packed with soldiers before moving it in. The knights then fired chain shot at its supports, cutting them, and the entire structure collapsed into the water, drowning many of the men aboard. At night, Ottoman swimmers tried to reach the base of the walls to place explosives. Up on the ramparts, the knights poured oil onto the surface of the water and set it alight, turning the sea itself into a thin sheet of fire that burned men as they swam in the dark. Under the ground, the Maltese made use of the sewer system. They channeled human waste, dead animals, and sometimes even human corpses into pits, letting them rot into a thick, foul liquid full of disease. Heated up, this boiling filth was poured down on soldiers climbing the ladders. Those who survived the burns often did not live long, dying later from infections and intestinal diseases. Dysentery and typhoid spread through the Ottoman camps, killing as many as sword and spear. In July, the Ottomans used a massive mine to blow down a section of the wall. Thousands of soldiers poured through the breach, convinced the end was near. At that moment, Valette, now over 70, picked up a pike and personally led the counterattack. The sight of the elderly commander standing in the thick of the fighting pushed the defenders beyond normal limits. Some knights were hit by several arrows. Others fought with their intestines already protruding, holding their wound closed with one hand while swinging a sword with the other. At certain points, they established what they called posts of death, positions that were expected to be lost. Knights assigned there would chain themselves to the walls, leaving no possibility of retreat. To get past them, attackers had to hack their bodies apart while the chains held them in place. The summer heat made everything worse. Bodies could not be buried fast enough and piled up layer upon layer. In some places, men fought on a surface made entirely of corpses, no stone visible beneath. The air grew heavy with the smell of decay. Flies swarmed so thick that in some areas they obscured the view. Many men vomited inside their helmets because they could not bear the stench. Water sources slowly became contaminated with blood, corpses, and waste. Both sides knew that drinking untreated water was almost a death sentence. So many soldiers turned to wine instead, even though it weakened their bodies over time. Eventually, both armies began to use corpses and disease as deliberate psychological weapons. The knights used catapults to hurl the bodies of plague victims into the Ottoman lines. The Ottomans answered by firing severed heads back, sometimes carving marks or symbols into the skulls as a kind of message. Many bodies were arranged in obscene poses. In some cases, faces were flayed and the skin stretched over shields. There were stories of genitals being cut off and stuffed into the mouths of corpses. All of this was meant to break the enemy's spirit, to humiliate and degrade them. The knights also created new weapons designed to prolong suffering. Hollow pikes that could inject boiling oil into wounds, barbed arrows that tore out flesh and organs when removed, sealed clay jars filled with scorpions and venomous snakes, thrown into crowds so that, when they shattered, the creatures spread panic and pain. Among the Maltese civilians, it was not only men who fought. Some stories tell of women pretending to signal surrender, waving Ottoman soldiers forward, then luring them into ambushes where children slashed their hamstrings with knives. Once the invaders fell, the adults finished them with stones or clubs. Old men who could no longer wield a weapon chose to throw themselves onto enemy spears, using their own bodies as obstacles to slow the advance for a few crucial moments. One story that the Maltese remember is about a woman named Katerina. During an attack, when the Ottoman flag was raised on a captured section of wall, she took her infant child and threw the baby at the standard bearer, knocking him off the wall. Then she grabbed the flag and threw herself from the wall with it, refusing to see the enemy banner flying over her homeland. Later, the Maltese named a bastion after her. Further out, both sides used torture as a kind of message. Captured knights were mutilated within sight of the walls but beyond arrow range. On the other side, some Ottoman officers taken prisoner were tortured, using medical knowledge to keep them alive and conscious longer, all while their comrades on the walls watched helplessly. Water, the most basic necessity, became a weapon as well. Malta had no rivers, only wells and rainwater cisterns. The defenders poisoned any water sources they thought the Ottomans might capture, using corpses and waste to foul the wells. Those who drank from them died horrible deaths from intestinal diseases. When they could, the Ottomans also threw dead animals into Christian water sources. Both sides tried to turn disease into an ally. For several months, every square yard of that rocky island bore the marks of the worst that human beings could imagine doing to one another. On August 7th, the Ottomans launched their greatest attack. They struck from both land and sea, throwing all remaining strength into one last effort. The battle raged for many hours. At one point, the Ottoman banners flew atop the walls of Birgu, and victory seemed within reach. At that moment, Valette played his last card. He ordered the galley slaves freed from their chains deep in the ships, promising that anyone who fought would have a chance at freedom. Around 500 men, who had lived under whips and shackles, stormed up to the walls and joined the fight with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. Ottoman units that had just climbed over the walls were pushed back, tumbling down onto their own comrades still climbing the ladders, dragging them into the moats below. By then, the ditches were no longer filled with clear water. They were thick with blood, oil, bodies, and melted fat. Very few who fell into them came out alive. One detail is often repeated. In the midst of this slaughter, when both sides were utterly exhausted, the fighting sometimes simply stopped. Not because of any agreement, but because the men were too tired to lift their weapons. Soldiers from both sides sat down among the dead, shared a little water or wine, and caught their breath. When a bit of strength returned, they stood up, and the killing began again. The battle now ran in shifts, not because of strategy, but because human bodies could not endure continuous combat any longer. In the Ottoman camps, food and water grew scarcer. Dysentery and typhoid continued to take lives every day. Some units slowly lost the ability and the will to fight. At some point, according to certain accounts, Ottoman units began refusing to join new assaults. It was not simply fear of death. It was fear of the ways they might die, scalded by boiling liquids, blinded by quicklime, thrown into pits full of corpses, struck by cannon-fired heads, or bitten by swarms of scorpions and snakes. Amid that atmosphere, a rumor spread that the knights ate the hearts of Ottoman soldiers to gain strength. There was no real evidence for this, but after 4 months of seeing things beyond imagination, many were ready to believe that the knights were capable of anything. On September 8th, a relief force from Spain finally reached Malta. It numbered only about 600 men. But in the eyes of an army exhausted in body and spirit, it looked like a much larger host. Mustafa Pasha ordered a retreat. The costliest Ottoman campaign in the Mediterranean up to that time, with 40,000 men committed, ended in failure. They left behind nearly 30,000 dead. On the side of the knights, of the original 500, only about half were still alive. Most of the armed Maltese had also fallen, yet Malta had not surrendered. When the guns finally fell silent, Malta was no longer the island it had been. The whole island looked like a surface covered in craters, ruined houses, shattered churches, collapsed buildings, and scattered bodies. The work of clearing the dead took months. Massive pyres were built to burn the corpses, and the flames were said to be visible from ships off Sicily. For years afterward, the soil of Malta, soaked with blood, corpses, waste, and bone ash, was difficult to farm. Even today, when archaeologists dig in Malta, they still find cannonballs lodged in walls beside fragments of human bone, silent witnesses to the siege. In Constantinople, Suleiman the Magnificent was furious at the failure in Malta. He began preparing an even larger expedition, planning to return to the island the following year. But he died before the campaign could be launched. After that, the Ottomans never again mounted a siege of Malta on that scale. For the Christian world at the time, the event became a symbol. If 500 knights and a small rocky island could stand firm against the vast Ottoman war machine, then perhaps the empire was not as unstoppable as it had seemed. The Maltese and the knights set about rebuilding. They decided to turn Malta into a single great fortress. The new capital, Valletta, named after Valette, was planned so that every street could be defended, and every building could become a strong point if needed. They prepared for another siege. But that siege never came. Those who survived Malta, on both sides, carried more than scars on their bodies. They carried wounds that had no name at the time. Doctors later wrote down what they saw when they examined survivors. Some knights had fought for weeks with broken arms or legs, and the bones had healed incorrectly on their own, leaving terrible deformities. Some men had fragments of swords and shot embedded in their bodies, with flesh grown over them, turning them into living containers for shrapnel. In some cases, infections were so advanced that a leg was nearly rotting away, but the man had tied it firmly and gone on fighting for several more days. On the Ottoman side, physicians also recorded janissaries who had been blinded by quicklime yet still tried to fight on, relying on their hearing and striking toward voices speaking Maltese. The endurance of pain shown by these men forced doctors to reconsider what they thought were the limits of human suffering. Economically, the Malta campaign was a heavy burden. The Ottomans are thought to have spent the equivalent of several years of state revenue, lost many of their best engineers, a significant portion of their elite janissaries, and around 200 experienced naval captains. The consequences spread beyond the battlefield. Across the Mediterranean, many Christian slaves began to rebel, believing that if Malta could resist, so could they. Venice and Spain, seeing that the Ottomans were no longer invincible, became more assertive in their maritime policies. Some Ottoman war debts went unpaid, contributing to financial crises. Seen another way, the men and money spent at Malta might have been enough to conquer much of Italy. Instead, they bought nothing but tens of thousands of graves on a small island. Perhaps the most dangerous legacy of Malta lay in the way people later thought about war. The methods used there, using corpses to spread disease, using human heads as ammunition, poisoning water supplies, torturing prisoners to break the enemy's will, were studied and written about by later commanders and military thinkers. In later European wars, especially the 30 Years' War, we see scenes that echo Malta. Heads displayed and fired from guns, bodies piled up as obstacles and walls, water deliberately fouled. It is as if Malta had opened a new door to cruelty. Some military manuals even devoted sections to Malta methods, actions considered too extreme for ordinary warfare, but possibly acceptable in desperate last stands. From this, a dangerous idea began to creep into the minds of many leaders, that anything at all could be justified by the word survival. In the end, there was also a painful irony. Later, Ottoman documents suggest that Suleiman had considered recalling the army if Malta had not fallen by September, because of the risk of autumn storms in the Mediterranean. On the Christian side, the Spanish relief force had actually been ready earlier, but was delayed by arguments and bureaucratic obstacles. If the Ottomans had withdrawn a month sooner, or if the relief force had arrived earlier, thousands might not have died in August, the month when the brutality reached its highest peak. But once war had slid so far down that slope, it developed its own momentum. Both sides kept killing, not so much because of clear strategic goals, but because too much blood had already been spilled, and the desire for revenge kept driving the fighting forward. Malta leaves us with a hard lesson. There are wars that, at some point, no longer serve any real purpose except to prolong the pain of what has already happened. Cruelty becomes its own justification for more cruelty. Thank you for listening all the way through this story. If you have lived through war, times of scarcity, or years marked by loss, I would be very grateful if you would share a few thoughts in the comments. When you look back at events like Malta, what strikes you the most? What do you think humanity has learned, and what has it lost? I always try to read your comments carefully, especially the memories shared by older generations. If you feel that this way of telling stories is helpful and worth following, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on the notification bell. In the next videos, we'll continue to walk together through other battles in human history, but always with the same spirit: respect for the truth, respect for those who died, and respect for the emotions of those who are listening.